Thank you, Your Eminence. I want to begin by enlisting your help. As a relatively new professor, I'm constantly on the hunt for tricks in the classroom today to outwit various student problems, often in the form of sort of sneaking in phones to text underneath the desk as though I'm not going to see it, or fiddling around on Facebook, or sleeping, no matter the time of day or the content of what's being discussed in the classroom. So part of my routine to avoid that is to sort of pace around the room and sort of rapid fire questions and comments at people to sort of wake them up and keep them on their toes. I will not do that, I hope, this afternoon, so that you can hear me. I'll stay close to the microphone. And I'll also try and sort of slow down a little bit. But if I fail on either of those, I want you to wave your hand or stick your tongue out or something to give me a signal that you're not quite getting what I'm trying to convey. So I'll rely on you for that assistance. I've cut a lot out this afternoon because, as I said yesterday, I do want us to have time for two things. I always find at public lectures the question period is the most interesting, certainly for me. And I also do want to have a chance for Monsignor McGee and I to pick up some of his really greatly appreciated and very graciously conveyed constructive criticisms of some of the things that I proposed. I think there's a great deal of merit in what he said, and I want to have a chance to sort of bring some of that out and talk a bit more about that. But nonetheless, having cut out things, I hope this coheres as one presentation. Normally when I'm asked about my work in Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy, I start off by giving a long list of people who have argued over the last 40-odd years of the importance of this question. I don't think that you need to be convinced of that thesis, so I won't go through that list except to just very briefly mention the names. Starting off, perhaps appropriately enough, in 1967, on the Catholic side by Paul VI, Pope Paul VI himself, saying that, quote, "The papacy is undoubtedly the gravest obstacle to the path of ecumenism." And others on the Catholic side will echo that down through the decades. Emmanuel Lan in 1971, in 1979, as he was still then, the Eastern Jesuit George Maloney. More recently, in 2004, Walter Cardinal Casper, then head of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. These are some of the names. There are others, and I go into some detail in the book about them. So recognize that in the dialogue, in the search for East-West unity, the papacy really is at the top of the list. That's echoed on the Orthodox side, even earlier in fact, in 1963 by John Meyendorff in a book, The Primacy of Peter, which is still in print. You've been able to purchase it here in the 1992 edition. And other Orthodox theologians over the last 15 years especially, Olivier Clément in 1997, Metropolitan John Zazoulis, the late Archbishop Vsevolod of blessed memory, and many other Orthodox theologians. In the book there are about 24 of them, in fact. One of the members of my jury, this began as a doctoral dissertation. One of the members of my jury was an Orthodox theologian, priest of the OCA, Father John Gillians, and he said to me, if nothing else, your book will be useful to us Orthodox for telling us what we actually say and having it gathered in one place. And so I tried to be really comprehensive in that regard, and surveying over the last half century all of the Orthodox theologians I could find in print that had something worthwhile to say about the papacy. So in other words, both sides have come to a common mind that this really is the big issue. Now, I'm not, of course, ignorant of there being other issues that we continue to have to work on. My book had been out all of about 5 minutes in March when it was sort of immediately attacked on Amazon by two self-identified Orthodox people, neither of whom knew me or had read the book yet, and said, this guy's in a dream world if he thinks that dealing with the papacy is going to solve anything. And give the usual, what I call the usual laundry list of filioque and azymes and clerical celibacy and all these issues. I'm aware that those are still challenges to some extent, but if we're going to do up a list, I think they're much further down the list. And so I do focus on the papacy, even as I'm aware that there are other issues that we're still working on. And I especially appreciated, as I said this morning, Sister Vasa's presentation, because I think it is that grassroots kind of work that is really important. We can continue to work on these things, we can continue to try to solve them, but without building those relationships between people at the parish level, a lot of this work is going to be simply making the same mistakes that we've made in the past. One of the other things I do is edit the journal Logos, a Journal of Eastern Christian Studies, and so I'm constantly getting books from publishers, and Cambridge University Press just last week reprinted what has long been one of the few studies in English on the Council of Florence by the Jesuit Joseph Gill. And as I read that book several years ago, and as I was flipping through the new edition, one salutary lesson from Florence, of course, is that if we don't carry the people, so to speak, with us, then we're going to be finding ourselves with some of the same problems as we had in the 15th century. So that kind of grassroots work, I think, is important. So too is the kind of work we're doing here. So I gathered together these Orthodox theologians, and there's a diversity of views. That should not surprise us. There's a diversity of views in Orthodox ecclesiology on any number of points. And if you followed the discussion from Ravenna onwards, you'll be aware of that. The point of tension, for example, over the role of the ecumenical patriarch, understood differently by many in Greek Orthodoxy than among the Russians in particular, and on other points as well. So there's a diversity of views in Orthodox ecclesiology in general and on the papacy in particular. But nevertheless, I think I synthesize all these various thinkers, and there are some clear common concerns and some clear common suggestions over how we could move past the papal roadblock. And so there's a consensus, I think, that I spell out. And one aspect of that consensus is the recognition of the importance of the role of the Patriarch of Rome. Why is that? What does that entail? Well, Orthodoxy, I think, is very clear that a recovery of that role and the attendant synodality that goes with it would be one very serious manifestation of Roman sincerity in moving towards genuine unity. To put that into practice, to recover patriarchal practices within the Latin Church would be one way of demonstrating real seriousness to the East about the desire for unity with it. Now, I have a long section of history in the book demonstrating, in fact, that for much of her history, the Roman Church has, in fact, lived, has embodied her life in patriarchal and synodal forms. That's not well known today, but there's at least 1,000 years of that happening. The Roman Church has always been marked by a kind of a good, not a partisan or an ideological, conservatism. And so the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea mandates that bishops are to gather twice a year, once during Lent and once in the fall after the harvest. And the Roman Church took that seriously until well into the second millennium. Regular gatherings of synods. Even the great reformer, some would say revolutionary, Gregory VII, 1075 to 1083, Hildebrand, does not dare attempt his far-reaching reforms without first talking to and getting the approval of his synod. Gradually, as we leave the 11th century, we see greater prominence being given to this new body of what are come to be called the cardinals in consistory, that take over some of the functions of the synod in the Roman Church. And then later still, especially from the 16th century, we find greater reliance being placed on members of the Roman Curia. And they, in turn, will pick up many of the responsibilities that once belonged to a synod of bishops. And they'll continue to exercise that responsibility down to the present day, although there has been an attempt since 1965 to recover some of that that practice of synodality in the Roman synods of bishops. Now, if you read Pope Paul VI's motu proprio establishing the synod and the subsequent canonical legislation, you realize, of course, it's not a functioning synod in the sense that the East understands synods. It has no legislative power of itself. In fact, the late Ukrainian Catholic Metropolitan of Winnipeg in Canada, Maxim Hermaniuk, rather archly dismissed the synods as nothing more than international study days for the Catholic bishops. He said, until we deal with the problem of the Roman Curia, these synods are really just a chance to talk and accomplish nothing. So there is that practice. There is a history of synodality in the Roman Church. I argue that we need to return to that and return to a recovery of the role of the Patriarch of Rome. Now, I was just starting this in 2006 when that rather stunning announcement came out that the title had been deleted from the Annuario. And so I shared, albeit not as acutely, the shock of Monsignor McGee at that announcement. And I immediately set to writing an article that I published in the spring of that year, an attempt to sort of calm the waters among the East and to say to Orthodox who were very concerned by it, and rightly so, that let's be hopeful. I didn't understand the decision at the time, and I said then, and I repeat now, that the rationale published, cobbled together very hastily, I think, by the Pontifical Council was and remains inadequate and unconvincing. The journal Irenicon published an editorial, in fact, about it and said that the explanation manifeste un certain embarras, shows a certain embarrassment, and I think that was true. So I would just today make a public plea that we need to know the long-term thinking behind that decision, and we have not, half a decade later, been apprised of that, assuming there is some, of course. Was this merely a decision towards a longer-term reconfiguration of the papacy, or was this something else? It would be helpful to know what the current thinking in Rome is on this, but we haven't heard. I went on anyway and said, even without knowing the answers, I mounted an argument why it's important to recover the title Patriarch of Rome, and made an argument along those lines. Not an original argument by any means. One of the other things I did was there are 17 Catholic theologians over the last 40 years whom I pressed into service to buttress this argument, beginning, as Monsignor McGee alluded yesterday, with none other than Joseph Ratzinger himself, who seems really almost single-handedly to have established this trajectory of thinking in Catholic ecclesiology. Others come after him and pick it up and recognize their indebtedness to him. People like Yves Congar, Jean-Marie Roger Tillard, J. Michael Miller, Christopher O'Donnell, Herman Pottmeyer, Frederick Bliss, George Nadungat, Miriam Violens, Walter Casper, Patriarch Gregorius III, and others, including, of course, Monsignor McGee. And they all said, with some differences between them, but they all came to the same conclusion that this is an important office still. We might not fully understand what it is, we might not understand how it might practice in the West, but it is an important office to recover and retain. All of them more or less left it there. And so what I did, sort of the creative moment in the book, was to say, well, what does that look like in practice? Let's move beyond just sort of talking about it, and let's sort of tease out some of the practical implications of that. What would that entail? And so to begin that sort of creative process, I said, well, let's look first at how the Orthodox patriarchates are structured. Let's begin there and see. And so what became very clear as I undertook that survey, and there are about a dozen in the book, I think, patriarchates that I review, ancient and modern, Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian, is there's an enormous diversity among them. And what also became very clear is what I call sort of one of the received myths of ecclesial governance that says, well, you know, the West is always papal and centralized and monarchical, and the East is always synodal and patriarchal. Well, if you know what you're talking about, you know that's just a lot of rubbish. There are periods in history in which certain patriarchs in the East had powers that Joseph de Maistre and Cardinal Manning, in their most ultramontane moments, would never have dreamed of assigning to the Pope of Rome. And there are periods in which patriarchs have had incredible power in their churches. Quite honestly, much more than the Pope of Rome has ever had. So there's a great diversity there. And I think it's important to highlight that diversity because some Catholics have a concern that, well, it's a very narrow model, and this is going to be an artificial imposition of Byzantine ecclesial structures on the Latin Church. And so what I tried to show was that there is no one model. There are no canons prescribing what a patriarch must or must not do, what a synod must or must not do. Each church has the autonomy to make those decisions in light of its own circumstance. And there's great beauty in that. It's allowed, for example, the Armenian Church to survive some incredibly horrific circumstances, not just in 1915, but for centuries before that. There's a flexibility in their structures that's allowed them to maintain leadership of the church, even as the church has had to move, quite literally, around the Anatolian Plateau and the Levant and elsewhere. So there's a great diversity there. And those who have studied patriarchal structures know that. George Nadungat, for example, Michael McGee again. John Erickson had an interesting line in which he said, the Orthodox theologian John Erickson, the line between legitimate primacy and what he calls neo-papalism has not been drawn. Louis Patsavos, the Greek Orthodox theologian, recognized there's a great diversity. And Patriarch Gregorius III, the Melkite Patriarch of Antioch, has also observed that in an article we published in Logos in 2005. So there's all this diversity, and I go into great detail in the book for those of you who are really interested in that. I sort of ended up categorizing these patriarchates into four categories. What I called first, the very centralized, and to my mind the clearest example of that is Constantinople. Next, the moderately centralized, and I put in there Moscow, Bucharest, and Alexandria, both Coptic and Greek. Third, the sort of decentralized structures, two examples of which, the Patriarch of Sofia and the Patriarch of Antioch, the Chalcedonian. And finally, the very decentralized, and that is the Armenian Church. The Armenian Church is really in a category by itself in some ways, and so I go into a little more detail about it than I do about some of the others, because it's the only structure in the world that's got two patriarchs and two Catholicos within one church. A very unique structure, again, partly understandable in light of the history of Armenia. So there's great diversity, and that I think is a good thing. And again, part of the reason I wanted to stress that diversity and to focus on, for example, Constantinople, was to allay fears on the part of some Catholics that the creation of a patriarchal structure within the Latin Church is necessarily going to create more problems, more disarray. There are arguments not just by Catholics, some Orthodox themselves have made them. John Meyendorff, back in the early 1980s, Patrick Reardon in 2006. And they've said, well, we don't want changes in the Catholic Church because we think the Catholic Church is already chaotic enough. We're concerned that there's going to be greater doctrinal disarray and heterodoxy with decentralized governance, so we want a very strong papacy. And of course, we can all appreciate the irony of that. And so part of what I attempted to do was to say, look, if you want to have those strongly centralized structures in the Latin Patriarchate, you can. It's possible to set it up in such a way that the Latin Church could continue to be governed in a very centralized way, even as we make distinctions about governance vis-a-vis the East. And so there is, again, no one model that all have to follow, but each is permitted to make the necessary arrangements in light of what you're facing in your own particular context. Having surveyed the Orthodox patriarchates, I then went on to sort of look in some detail at what would a patriarchate in the Latin Church look like. And this was sort of going beyond what's been done to date as well. And I did that because I felt that that was really important. It's one thing to say, well, we need to make changes, and I think we all agree on that. But to leave it at that level, I think, allows us to escape our responsibility sometimes. It's like I have a rather obnoxious colleague who feels that he's some kind of moral hero just for clicking on a link on a website to sign a petition, and that's going to make the world a better place. It's constantly sort of sending us, well, sign this, and we'll fix, famine or poverty or some kind of issue. I said, well, that doesn't really do very much. What can we actually do about it? And so that's part of the sort of the practical thrust of my work. And others have said that we need to do that. John Meindorf rightly said in 1980 that in discussing issues of ecclesiology, the temptation is always great to manipulate concepts and doctrinal definitions while avoiding a critical approach to their application in practice. Asaf Ernevich said the same thing. Yves Congar has argued this. The retired Archbishop of San Francisco, John Quinn, in his book said this. Walter Cardinal Casper has said this on several occasions. We need to look at the forms in which the papal primacy is exercised. We need to look at the practice of it. We need to spell that out. And I think if you read between the lines, even in the statement issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the primacy of the successor of Peter in the mystery of the Church, it recognizes that there need to be some more practical reflections on what reform would actually look like. And so that's what I spent the rest of the book doing. What would this look like in practice? I really wanted to proceed here with great caution, because for several reasons, I say in the book. I'm not obviously a member of the episcopate, thank God. I don't enjoy the charism of the Holy Spirit to make these decisions. Just my own temperament finds it very irritating when people sort of attempt to sort of micromanage you and provide this very elaborate sort of job description you have to fit into everything. That's not my role. So there was an attempt to balance sort of, let's be practical, let's specify some things, but I don't want to get into too much detail. And so what I had in mind here was Congar's Great Law. In his really important book, published in 1950, and only finally later this year, coming into English, Vraie et fausse réforme dans l'Église, Congar had this to say: La grande loi d'un réformisme catholique sera donc de commencer par un retour au principe de catholicisme. Il faudra d'abord interroger la tradition, se replonger en elle. The great law, as he calls it, of Catholic reform consists of a return, begins by a return to the principles of Catholicism. It is necessary to interrogate the tradition, to re-immerse oneself in that tradition. And so, as I was sort of specifying some of the practical implications of papal reform and what a Patriarchate of Rome would look like, I really wanted to sort of keep that in mind and say, well, let's go back to the tradition. Let's see what was there and see if we can bring it into a new time with the necessary adjustments, and allow it to flourish once again. And so many of the suggestions I make in the book were not ex nihilo, but ex traditione, from the tradition. Only when I felt I'd sort of exhausted that route did I sort of put forward some new suggestions that I thought nonetheless were tied to the tradition, or certainly expressions of the tradition. We remember, of course, the tradition is living, tradition is not dead, in Jaroslav Pelikan's famous definition. And so I wanted to bring out, the gospel verse about the householder who brings out treasures both old and new. That was part of what I attempted to do. And so to give some practical form to these, but not too much. Again, I didn't want to write a sort of canonical terms of reference. Well, here, Pope, this is what you got to do, and this is what you can't do, because then that's not my job. What I attempted to do, and I quote Olivier Clément in the book, I thought he summed it up quite nicely in his book on the papacy. He said, the one essential thing would be to pass from a situation where the hierarchical dovetailing of power structures has legal backup to one where tensions are held in balance without predetermined juridical solutions. And so there was tried to strike that balance in the book, and I leave it up to you to determine whether I struck that balance appropriately or not. And I'm sincere in saying that. I welcome your comments if you've had a chance to read it or when you do. And so there were sort of four practical things that I conclude the book by suggesting for reform within the Latin Church and reform of the papacy as such. The first of these was the establishment of regional patriarchates within the Latin Church. I said we need 6 of those. I went on the basis of the continents. And I argued why I chose that way. There were other ways that we could have gone. There are still ways that I'm thinking might work, but that was the one way that I ended up describing in some detail in the book. In part because a continent, of course, is not a nation or a nation state, and we avoid all of the complex problems that arise when we tie ourselves too closely to nationalist structures. So I said, well, a patriarch of North America, one of South America, one of Europe, one of Africa, another of Asia, and a 6th for Australia with responsibility for the Southern Pacific region. That was the first thing I proposed. And I said, well, patriarchates always have other institutions as part of their life. There's a patriarchal city, of course. I said, well, in some cases for the continents, it's very obvious which city that's going to be. For Europe, Rome is the only obvious contender. For Africa, Alexandria is the only obvious contender. I said, but what do we do about North America, South America, Asia, and Australia? And so what I ended up doing was saying, sort of extrapolating from the principle of apostolicity to say, when was the first apostolic foundation in the Latin Church made on those continents, and where was it? And in the case of North America, that was Quebec. For South America, it was Santo Domingo. For Australia, it was Sydney. I said, well, we could conceive those being the patriarchal sea cities. The trickier issue was, well, first of all, how do we define Asia, and where should we look in Asia? You know, is Turkey part of Asia? Does that therefore mean that we look to Constantinople? How do we define that? In the end, I settled on Jerusalem as being really the obvious contender. There are other contenders, of course, but that was what I had suggested there. So these continental patriarchates and their sea cities, and then the 2 other institutions that go along, the full patriarchal synod, of course, and then the permanent or the Endemusa synod, the residential synod, as it were, that has its origins in the late 4th century in the bishops who were in and around the city of Constantinople, those who could gather quickly to advise the patriarch when that was necessary. So that was those are the 3 of the 4 major proposals that I made. I'll come back to this in a minute to pick up on some of the things that Monsignor McGee rightly raised yesterday. The 4th thing that I proposed was not really my own idea. It was a joint Eastern Catholic, Eastern Orthodox proposal just touched on in 1996. Father Thomas Hopko was on a plane with Father Andrzej Czarowski, my Dr. Vater, and they were talking about, well, what do we need to do to deal with the problem of the papacy? And one of the things they came up with was this idea of an ecumenical synod, of all the heads of the churches gathered together with the Bishop of Rome to take decisions for the life of the universal church. And so that's what I ended the book with, was this suggestion for what I called an ecumenical synod with the patriarchs together to exercise their watchfulness over the unity and the faith of the church. And I returned, since I started with Ut Unum Sint, I returned to Ut Unum Sint in the final section to sort of flesh out what that ecumenical synod would look like and how we could imagine it living its role, especially in light of Pastor Aeternus and Vatican I. Many people often assume that Vatican I is an insurmountable hurdle. I agree it's a formidable hurdle. I don't agree it's insurmountable. I think properly understood, that we can find a way forward. through that, and I attempted to do that a little bit towards the end. I didn't engage those issues entirely. They still bear thinking through, I think, but I attempted to deal with them to some extent. But let me come back to this notion of the regional patriarchates, because it's been raised as a critical question, and again, I am genuinely grateful for that. I did, as I said, attempt to not be overly precise, and to stick as closely to tradition as I could in what I fleshed out. Monsignor McGee yesterday rightly raised the question. Well, patriarchates they're not just generated, they're not engineered. They do sort of develop in history in ways that we don't always fully appreciate. So perhaps my proposal sort of violates that a little bit. It's maybe a bit artificial, and I can grant that point. But what I would say in response to that is the following. We've seen in both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, just in the last 2 years, it goes back a little further than that, but just in the last couple of years, new ecclesial structures being created. And I think that I don't want to sound too glib, but we should not, be not afraid to continue to do that a little bit. In the Catholic side, we've seen the new creation of these ordinariates for Anglicans entering into full communion with the Catholic Church. We earlier, back in the early 1980s, if I remember the chronology correctly, we saw another new ecclesial structure being created, the personal prelature for Opus Dei. Both of those are attempts to meet new situations in the life of the Catholic Church. Whether they're entirely successful or not, I can't say. I think, especially in the case of the ordinariate, we simply can't judge at this point, because in some cases they're not even fully erected yet. But there's at least a movement there to establish some new forms. On the Orthodox side, and I allude to this, I think, in one of the end notes of the text, and I apologize for end notes. I despise them, and I argued vigorously with the publisher for footnotes, but I lost that battle. But it is in here at some point, the so-called episcopal assemblies that the Orthodox churches have been attempting to set up just beginning from June of 2009. And this is an attempt, too, to deal with new situations in the Orthodox world, especially here in North America, which, as many Orthodox themselves will concede, perhaps most bluntly the late Archbishop Vsevolod, when he said, North America is just a mess. And that's clear ecclesiologically, and that's a problem. So the Orthodox have been attempting to deal with that in these new episcopal assemblies. Again, I think it's too early to judge whether that's going where that's going. Some people have said, well, this is ultimately going to lead to a patriarchate for North America. I've talked to 2 Orthodox priests, theologians in the OCA, who sort of take the opposite tack to that, roll their eyes and said, this is just scoba in a new dress. This is not going to do anything. But I take the position that I think we need to wait and see what's going to come of these new assemblies. My point being, on both the Catholic and the Orthodox side, we're attempting to come up with new structures that attempt to meet and deal with new situations, and I think that's a good thing. Now, Monsignor McGee also made the point that, well, let's not then perhaps use the term patriarchates for them. And I'm certainly open to that. In fact, I'd welcome discussion on that. I use that term in the book because, of course, of its obvious antiquity, its history, the fact that it's going to be familiar to people, and that was very much what was in mind. But I don't necessarily think we need to be wedded to that phrase if we can come up with others. I'm certainly open to those, to talking about that kind of terminology. But I do persist in my point that we need, I think, to look at regional structures within the Latin Church, both for the good of the Latin Church and then also, of course, for the search for unity with the East, to demonstrate that it is possible to live fully a patriarchal ecclesial life as a church in communion with the Bishop of Rome, but not subject to him. And part of what I specify is that so many of the responsibilities that have accrued to the Roman Curia could then devolve back to these synods in the Latin Church, because that's the real problem for a lot of Orthodox. I quote this phrase that I've used for years now, and I've never been able to find the provenance of it. If any of you know who actually said it, I should be very grateful to hear. But it's the old line, it's not the Pope we Orthodox fear, it's the Pope's helpers. And that's part of what the creation of patriarchal structures attempts to deal with. Not to demonize the Roman Curia. If you know any of them, if you've been to Rome to talk to them, many of them work incredibly hard, very loyal, very faithful, very holy people, working under very straitened circumstances. I think they often get a very bad rap for simply doing their jobs. And I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing them for that. But there is a serious ecclesiological problem of delegated authority that's all supposedly exercised in the name of the Bishop, the Pope of Rome. Although I think we've had a number of occasions in which we might wonder whether the Pope really did know what was going out under his name. My late spiritual father, the Archpriest Robert Anderson of blessed memory, used to say, "What I want is the name of the human being who put out all of these documents." He says, because if you go on Zenit or various other news services, there's 20 announcements a day. Well, the Pope did this, the Pope did that, the Pope wrote this, the Pope said this, the Pope went here. He says, no human being can possibly do all of this. So what actual human being did this? And I think that's an important question to look at, and that is a concern that I took seriously in some of my proposals. I think I'll end here rather than sort of go into too much more detail about them, because, as I said, I do want to allow time for questions and then for some of the panel discussion as well. So thank you very much.